Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
Warning. Quick disclaimer for today's episode, we'll be discussing things about pedophilia, child murder, cannibalism, and sexual crimes against children. If this is too much for you to handle, take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Alright, welcome back, folks. It's been a bit. I've just been busy with work and trying to write this in the meantime here. Well, it's a pleasure as always here to give you guys some more episodes and all that. Now, this next case, we're going to cover Albert Fish. So this case is going to be fucking gross. And we'll dive into a lot of gory details on like child rape, child murder, child molestation, torture, and a lot of other sick things. So in order to tell you guys this tale, I have to go into full detail on this. So if this case isn't for you, I'm going to catch you here on the next episode here, and we're going to try to cover everything that we possibly can on Albert Fish. In most cases, but not all, child molesters are like a stranger to their victim. Others get to know their victim over time. They build a bond, and then they strike after some careful planning, etc. Or sometimes the rapist sees something that they desire, and they just take what they seek, kind of thing. Sometimes it can also be like a family member, and that's fucking gross, and it's really shocking. I mean, this shit ruins kids' lives, families' lives, stuff like that, right? And in some cases, the children do make it out alive, but in some cases, they don't. Now, child murder is the unnatural death of a child under the age of 18 for which another person is responsible. Now, the principle defines a child as a person below the age of 18. Now, Albert Fish here, this guy was fucking gross. I went through a lot of detail on this. And he was one of the most notorious serial child killers of all fucking time. He committed at least 3 confirmed child murders between July 1924 and June 1928. But I mean, over the years, I'm sure there's many more victims. Some estimate the killings vary from 8 to as many as 15. Now, Fish had often targeted those from marginalized backgrounds. So, obviously, this would make him a serial killer. And that's a person who murders 3 or more people. The full extent of his atrocities will never be known, because this dude just felt driven to torment and kill children. Now, some say he was the most depraved child murderer of the 20th century. And you know what? They're probably right. Now, the 20th century was a century that began on January 1st, 1901, and ended on December 31st, 2000. Now, during his life, some have described Fish as a depraved individual who lacked over his grotesque sexual fantasies. So, depraved, this is someone characterized by extreme moral corruption, lack of moral standards, or perversion, and does a lot of evil or harmful behavior, often exhibiting incapacity for cruelty or wickedness. So he's reportedly victimized hundreds of children in the 1900s. So victimized meaning like cruel or like unjust treatment. And Fish sure handed that out. Through his years, it's said he lived or traveled through 23 states. So, I mean, you can only imagine all the things that we didn't hear about. Him committing like extremely horrible and disgusting acts on children during his lifetime. Now, he bragged upon his capture that he had a child in every state. And most of the towns that he visited, like for work and all that, this is how he got away with his shit, right? Because he was like a traveling house painter. So that was his job. So it allowed him to travel wherever work was available. And this was all across the United States. So he was working in like public buildings and such. They work on like large scale or industrial painting projects. So that was his gig. And this had given this dude a lot of leeway. Like there'd be cellars that he would work in, basements, shit like that, so he would creep around, right? Now there would be some occasional attics where he'd go and he'd fix up and he'd paint. And it would be like really secluded here in these areas, really quiet. So Albert would have the time to do his thing. I mean, the guy was like a good painter and everything. He always got hired like on all these random jobs and stuff, right? And he could work well on his own. So nobody would bother him here, like if he brought up a child or things of that matter, right? Now, mainly because like he worked alone and stuff, right? Sometimes on bigger projects he'd have people, but he'd sneak off and do his own dirt somewhere else. Some of his job details would be shit like, like reading specifications to determine material needs, remove old wallpaper, loose paint, repair walls, mixing, thinning paint, measuring, cutting, and applying wallpaper. And some of the other stuff he'd do, like he would paint large scale structures, kind of like factories or warehouses, right? New homes, businesses, and this was all during like initial construction. Now he would repaint existing homes, other businesses, stuff like that, if they needed a touch up. And when this guy worked, what he did, he would just wear overalls, shoes, and socks. So this was like a quick way to undress rather quickly, rape a child after luring them up there to like one of these destinations and stuff. And he could then dress quickly and act like nothing had happened. And like I said, he was on the move for like many years, and he used many aliases along the way. It was Frank Howard, Thomas A. Sprague, Robert Hayden, and John W. Pell. Now, some had made mention that his crimes were the result of like a family mental illness, like throughout the whole family and stuff, right? Or there was some abuse suffered as a child, but I looked everything up and I couldn't really find any abuse by the parents. But the mental illness thing, it goes back 2 generations. There were like 7 people in the family that suffered from psychosis. So mental illness did run in the family, right? So there's no doubt about that. So what psychosis is, well, it's a disconnection from reality. People may have false beliefs or they may experience things that aren't real. And psychosis isn't a condition. It's like more of a term that describes a collection of symptoms. There's also like hallucinations and shit. These are when parts of your brain mistakenly act like they would if your senses, like your vision, your hearing, touch, smell, or taste, had picked up on something actually happening. An example of hallucination is like hearing voices that aren't there, like an auditory hallucination. So, during an episode of psychosis, a person's thoughts and perceptions are disrupted, and they may have difficulty recognizing what is real and what isn't. Along with this, there's also suspiciousness, paranoid ideas, decline in self-care, trouble thinking clearly, and difficulty telling reality from fantasy. Now also, there's delusions, which are false beliefs that someone holds on to even when others don't believe them, or that there's plenty of evidence that a belief isn't true. And as we were speaking about illnesses in thy family, there was an uncle that Fish had with religious delusions, or as they called it back then, religious mania. So religious delusions differ from religious and spiritual beliefs or faith. They are associated with certain psychiatric disorders such as like schizophrenia or other conditions that alter a person's mental state. Generally, delusions make a person feel sure of something that isn't true. And usually, people that have more severe cases, they feel more convinced that their delusions are real. Now, that uncle died up in a state hospital, and he also had an aunt on his father's side that was completely crazy. So treatment for this will depend on a person's circumstances. Some might just need like medication, or some might need therapy. And there was also a younger brother in the family here. This dude was feeble-minded, and he died of hydrocephalus. Hope I said that right. So this is the buildup of fluid in cavities called ventricles deep within the brain. The excess fluid increases the size of the ventricles, and then it puts pressure on the brain. But the pressure of too much cerebrospinal fluid can damage the brain tissues and or cause a range of symptoms related to brain function. So it's a little bit about the family tree there. Now back to Albert here. Well, obviously he wasn't born under that name. His birth name is Hamilton Howard Fish. He was born May 19th, 1870 up in Washington, D.C., United States. Now Washington was founded on July 16th, 1790. And this is the capital city, and it's the federal district of the United States. The city was named after George Washington, the first president of the United States, who served from 1789 to 1797. Now, Albert was the family's youngest child. Albert's parents were Randall and Ellen Fish. Now, over the course of their marriage, they had 5 children. So there was Walter R. Fish, born 1859, Annie Fish, born 1863, Edwin F. Fish, born 1868. He passed in 1914. Then there's Albert, and then there was Annie M. Fish, born 1871. Randall, the father, he was born up in Kennebec County, Maine, USA, back in 1795, and he was the ripe age of 75 when his son Albert was born. Now, Maine's a cool little place there. I looked it up. It's, very well known for its parks. Has a bunch of lighthouses. And they have a lobster industry here that's a pretty big fucking deal. Now, Maine actually produces most of the lobster in the United States. But peak season here is like late summer and fall. And lastly, they have a proud history as an agricultural state. And they're also famous for like wild blueberries and potato crops. Now, for work over his life, Randall was a Potomac River boat captain through most of his life. And by 1870, he got a gig as a fertilizer manufacturer in his later years. Now, he thought he'd have better luck as a fertilizer manufacturer because this would be a business that produces fertilizers using raw materials like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're essential for like plant growth, and they're used to increase crop yields and improve soil fertility. And his son, young little Hamilton, attended school, and there was a woman teacher here at one time who would like kind of pull down the pants or dresses of the girls, and she would spank them on the bare bottom. Now, most kids in school usually cried out or screamed, like, stop, whatever, right? But young Hamilton, he liked to be spanked. He also enjoyed being spanked himself. And he later mentioned, quote, "I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy things that hurt." Now, back to the father here. Randall passed away from a heart attack on October 16, 1875, in the old Pennsylvania station. This is actually where President Garfield was shot. Now, Randall was around the age of 80, and he was buried in the Congressional Cemetery up in Washington. So a heart attack, obviously, that can happen when the flow of blood that brings oxygen to the part of your heart muscle suddenly becomes blocked. Then your heart can't get enough oxygen, and if blood flow isn't restored quickly, the heart muscle will begin to die. Now, back to it here. Albert's mother, she was Ellen Frances Fish, born 1838 up in Ireland. She eventually passed on October 10th, 1903, and she stuck around to the age of 65 and passed in Newark, Essex, New Jersey, United States. And she was buried by the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in East Orange, Essex County, New Jersey, USA. But during her life, the mother Ellen might have had schizophrenia and suffered from like some type of mental illness. She was known to have oral or auditory and or visual hallucinations. The mother was also known to run the streets, screaming, yelling, flipping out, saying that she heard things in the streets. So all the neighbors and everything would actually see her going nuts and having all their crazy antics in the streets. So, with young Albert's father now passed away, this left the fucking crazy mom to look after the children. But, unfortunately, she couldn't look after them financially, because Randall was the breadwinner of the family. But Fish's mother went looking for another source of livelihood due to her inability to take care of her son and the other children. So, what she did here was all the children in the family were sent to different orphanages all around the place during this time, and she promised to come back for them. Now, Albert had a lot going on. I mean, he was the age of 5. His fucking father died. His mom put him in an orphanage here, and she ended up fucking off on him. And now he has to readjust to the brutal life here with no family. So at the orphanage, while staying here, he suffered manners of physical and sexual abuse, humiliation, and torture. So, in turn, this would make him become more sadistic while he was here. Albert had even stated himself later on that his stay here had contributed significantly to his deviant behavior. Now, Albert would blame the orphanage and what he had experienced there for ruining his mind. In an article I found, Albert mentions that we were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things that they should not have done. And as Fish saw and experienced plenty of these acts here, most of them were like a lot of perversions. There was forced masturbation in front of the other children, brutal beatings, whippings, and canings and shit. But besides this, Albert did have his downtime here. He sang in the choir at the orphanage here, so I mean, there's a fucking plus side. And obviously, this here was a big fucking adjustment for him. Like, when you're the youngest one in the orphanage here, you're socially awkward. It's just bad for the kid, right? The ones that actually ran the place were a bunch of tough asses, too. And they would whip children as punishment, make them do weird punishments and shit. And this place was called St. John's Orphanage up in Washington, D.C. This is actually a Catholic orphanage that housed boys initially between the ages of 5 and 16. It was run by the Sisters of Mercy. So what they are, the Sisters of Mercy is a religious institute for women in the Roman Catholic Church. It was founded in 1831 in Dublin, Ireland by Catherine Macaulay. Now, fast forward to 2019 here, the whole institute had about 6,200 sisters worldwide. So they grew over the years, right? And it was organized into a number of independent congregations. Now, the orphanage capacity back then was intended for like 100 children, but eventually it peaked over 200 during like World War II. And then with all the shit going on and everything, it was eventually demolished back in 2023. But later on, it was found that the industrial schools had been like really harsh and insensitive to the needs of the children. that it was inadequate and did not meet their basic needs. So it was here that he would stay from 1875 to 1879, so 4 fucking years. And he stayed there until he was nearly 9 years old. And then his mother popped back up. She was all like, hey, I got more money and shit. I'm more financially stable to look after my kids. Now, his time there was nothing but beatings, punishments by the staff, and all the other boys that stayed here. Like, fucking young Albert was physically raped and everything here, right? Because the crew were like a bunch of spare the rod, spoil the child type people, right? It's the rule that they lived by. And it was a children's home ran by the Episcopal Church in the city's Foggy Bottom neighborhood. Now, the abuse here had taught Fish to associate pain with pleasure, a connection that, he would kind of shape up in his later crimes and stuff. Teachers would shred the kids' clothes off. This was a form of shame punishing. Then they would whip them. Sometimes they use a cane made of like birch wood. That would be used. And the boys were typically caned on their backsides. And if there were any girls, they'd usually be struck in the hands and the arms and sometimes the legs. There was one teacher there that liked to add public humiliation. So like she would force the children to strip bare and stand before the class. Stuff like that. And it was here where Albert would become like completely different, and the abuse made Albert into something else. Totally changed this kid. Now, he later mentioned it awoke something that was deep, deep inside of me. And after the orphanage, he was never the same again. Now, I found some articles here saying that, where he talks about all this, he said, quote, I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. Albert said, here I learned to lie, beg, and steal. I also saw a lot of things a child of 7 should not see. There were so many boys whipped. He would experience his sexual feelings and all that during these times too. And as he watched the other children get beat, suffer and all that, it actually aroused him sexually. And the nuns had to deal with overcrowding classrooms and shit. A lot of kids that misbehaved. So they were already pissed off about things. So they would punish the boy students in a lot of weird ways, day in and day out. And those boys would be frequently battered and bruised all the time, and they would just beat them in gross, demeaning ways, making them strip naked, hit them with whips and canes for not behaving. Some of the stuff was sexual, so after getting this abuse daily for years, Albert just grew accustomed to this. And these experiences, they furthered his obsession with S&M and all that. And along with this, he came to relish physical pain from the communal beatings and related sadistic acts of brutality. Now, in the 1870s, all this shit was normal to drop off kids at these places. Parents sometimes placed children in orphanages due to extreme poverty, the inability to care for them, just like Fish's mother. Sometimes they would be put there due to illnesses or death, or because they were unable to provide the basic needs like food and shelter, leading them to surrender their children to institutions for care and potential placement with other families, if they deserted them and shit like that. So orphanages and hospitals here up in the urban areas have become more common. Children without parents could be placed in these institutions and families could adopt them, although this process might not have been strictly regulated. Now, upon leaving the orphanage and all its cruelty, he asked his mother to legally change his name to Albert, and that was the name of one of his dead siblings. He said this because of the other children there. They actually found the name of Hamilton fucking hilarious. So they actually called him a nickname of Ham and Eggs, and this is something that he really did not like. Now, by the age of 11, he took a hard fall out of a cherry tree here, and he fucking biffed it pretty hard. Maybe that fall plays a factor in some of this stuff. maybe not. But falling from a tree could possibly cause some head trauma due to the fall. Like, it depends on like how you landed, how hard you hit, etc. And although he returned home, he had a habit of wetting the bed in his sleep. So this happened for many years here, and this wore off around the time that he was the age of 11. Now, he did some gross stuff, like drinking urine, eating poop, and this was going on the age of 12. Now, perhaps his fascination with all that was from like the time at the orphanage and some sort of punishment or something like that. Definitely could have happened. And as back then, usually if a kid threw up or they soiled themselves like throughout the punishment and stuff, they would then be singled out and punished by either eating puke or their feces, depending on the severity of the punishment and whatnot. So the act of drinking urine is called urophagia. So this is a term for the consumption of urine. Urine was used in several ancient cultures for like various health reasons, like healing and cosmetic purposes. Urine drinking is actually still practiced today. Originally, drinking your own piss is like a survival tactic, but somewhere down the line it became a sexual thing. Ugh. And also, people may be forced to drink urine as like some form of like torture or humiliation. And like who knows where he picked this up at? Most definitely, the orphanage or whatnot. Who knows? Albert's actually just a weird fuck. But growing into his adolescence and now coming back to Washington with his mother, he was a changed boy. He'd now become like a sexual voyeur and began spending his spare time visiting public bathhouses and stuff. So this is where he could watch other children undress and shower and bathe and whatnot. Now, voyeurism is the act of gaining sexual pleasure through watching or recording. Now, it's a violation of privacy, obviously, and it does like lend itself to a little bit of power and control and all that, because it's a form of paraphilia. So these guys here are pretty persistent, and it's a recurrent sexual interest, urges, fantasies, behaviors from some individuals. Now, voyeurs do not seek sexual contact with the people being observed. Voyeurism usually begins during adolescence or early adulthood. Some degree of voyeurism is common, more among like boys than it is men. And by Albert's late teens, he'd start stalking children. He'd learn how to lure his victims with like pocket change, some candy that he would pick up at the stores and stuff. And he learned how to take advantage of like all the old buildings and the dark alleys and stuff. And it was around this time where he did a lot of things with kids sexually. Like I said, he'd bribe them with a little bit of cash or talk it up with them a little bit. He'd play Mr. Nice Guy. And once close, in the dark alleys and whatnot, or where he had them in a secluded area, he would forcibly push them into the alleys, cellars, or attics, or whatever, and he would do his deranged deeds. Now, according to Fish, when he relocated to New York, this was around the time of 1890, he began his crimes against children. He made money working as a prostitute, and he would start to like molest boys. Whether they would pay him or whether they would not, he would just fucking do his craziness. And that was an easy way for him to make his money, because like he lived in poverty and poor living conditions as well. Now, poverty meaning the inability to afford basic necessities like food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare. So Fish drifted through odd jobs over his years. We traveled the country and pieced together a living, all while hunting, sexually assaulting, and doing whatever he was in the mood to do. And sometimes this would be killing children. And what he mostly did was target African American boys because he believed that they were less likely to be noticed or searched for once they went missing. He figured police didn't give a fuck, right? And the police didn't really go to too much trouble if the child was like a black child or if the child was a like special needs, shit like that. And Fish was just a sneaky prick. Sometimes he would pay a girl to bring him boys from all around the different neighborhoods and shit, right? Fish, in his later years, had recalled there was an event with a black boy named Noonan. I guess he could remember some of his sexual assaults, not all of them, but Noonan, he was brought to Albert from the girl that he paid the $5 a week to. Now, she gathered up boys for him, and he told the boy this like big, awesome party. And he ended up giving him some candy. So the two like went off. But instead, he brought the kid to this abandoned house. And this was a recently painted house that he had finished. There was nobody there. And there was no party. The kid found this out rather quickly. And Fish then strangled the child. He cut up his body and ate some of his arm. And upon doing so, he noticed that the kid had shit himself upon his death. Now, people may void their bowels and bladder, including defecation upon death due to muscle relaxation. Now, as the muscles relax, the sphincter muscles that control the bowel, bladder functions and all that, they lose their tension, allowing the contents to be released. Now, upon death, the muscles throughout the body, including those of like the bladder and the bowels, they relax. Now, this relaxation removes the pressure and control that normally keeps the sphincter muscles closed. And with the muscles relaxed, the force of gravity can cause the contents of the bladder and bowels to be expelled. When Fish noticed this, he decided to eat this kid's fecal matter with some of his food, so he mixed in with that. Now, the act of this is called coprophagia. Now, this is the act of eating feces, which is very fucking rare and often associated with like various mental and physical conditions like schizophrenia, dementia, and sometimes even autism. This could even be from like a neurological disorder like a brain tumor or OCD, etc. Now, since Fish had very little formal education and he grew up learning to work more with his hands than his brain, he just started working odd jobs here and there. And Fish had all kinds of fucked up ideas, especially involving children. Now, many of his victims had come from like disadvantaged backgrounds, right? Meaning like an individual's upbringing or some social circumstances that have negatively impacted their ability to achieve certain outcomes, like their education or like their career success. And he preyed on kids because he viewed them as easy targets due to their innocence and their vulnerability. So Fish had developed his interests here and he began engaging in self-harm. Now, in his teens, his psychiatric issues went largely untreated. This could be from like some sort of genetic predisposition as well, combined with like childhood instability, most likely had created the foundation for most of Fish's psychological issues. Now, Fish, during his life, was a regular churchgoer. He read and he studied the Bible throughout his life. He knew a lot of the verses and all the different passages. And he would also write obscene letters to women. And he got their names from like classified ads and like matrimonial agencies and shit like that, like people looking to marry and all that. Now, this is a business here that provides matchmaking services to potential customers. And they have a view towards like romance or marriage, and you would reply to them, kind of like love ads, shit like that. Now, he'd write women about what he'd like to do to them and what he would like to be done to him, like crazy, freaky ass shit. There was one time he asked someone to whip young boys with them. A woman answered him at one time. This was a reply to him. And when he showed up, like for like a first date or whatnot, he actually brought a length of rope or some clothesline here that was wrapped up in a piece of wrapping paper. And he told her that he wanted to be beaten with it. And obviously she declined this offer from Fish, and she had later notified the police when he left and he dipped out, and he actually left the piece of rope behind. She also called up and made a complaint to the advertisement agency, but they didn't see anything in which to complain, right? I guess, hey, sorry about that, people are fucking crazy. And for the next little bit, like we mentioned, Fish had worked as a house painter here for a dude named McClean. So he worked for him for a period of 7 years. Originally, since he was like a Bible thumper and shit, Fish wanted to become a minister, like during some period of his life. He actually did Bible classes and shit like that. He learned a lot of this in the orphanage too. Now, it was the only thing that he enjoyed while he actually spent his time there that he later mentioned. He also sang as a soprano in the church choir, so that gave him the attention that he craved. And then he got like a little bit of attention by the community, right? Because, he was a good fucking choir boy or whatnot. But over time he lost interest in the higher power, but it did stick with him in his head. And he knew his shit when it came to religion too, like, because he spewed the words of thy Lord out at anybody who would listen. And later on he found this like whole love for art and literature. So he hid away in the Corcoran Gallery of Art, and he became extremely obsessed with what is called Cubism. This is a early 20th century art movement that revolutionized how art's depicted in reality. Like an example on this, Cubist artists broke down objects into geometric shapes, often from multiple angles at once. So instead of a single point of view, Cubists' art, like, their aim to show the subject's entirety by incorporating different vantage points. Cubist art relied heavily on geometric shapes like squares, triangles, and circles to represent the objects. Some influence on this would be like Picasso, George Braque, and Paul Cézanne. Now, Fish would later start writing like inscriptions and scrolls in churches here too. He also got into Edgar Allan Poe and other such stories. And what he read was a lot about torture, especially a book that Poe had called The Pit and the Pendulum. It's a short story by Poe, first published in 1842, I believe. Now, the story here is about all the torments endured by a prisoner of the Spanish Inquisition. So Fish read everything that he could on the historical reign of terror. He also found a love for like newspaper articles on people that had died or were killed, and these were posted in the newspaper. He focused on like lynchings and actual murders and shit, right? He actually collected and hung the articles of the bizarre crimes and carried them around until they were like really old and yellow, and then they crumbled into nothing, right? So he fucking kept on to these. Now, sometimes he would take these out and he would look at them, and then he would jerk off as he thought of reenacting these acts. There were also two cases that he was intrigued by, Vincent Versenni and H.H. Holmes. Now, Versenni was a murderer who terrorized the Italian countryside, and Holmes was a mass murderer who operated in classic Gothicism. So by the age of 12 here now, he was meeting around like with some kids and shit. There was this messenger boy that he met. So back in the day, messenger boys were like young boys, often under the age of 18, who delivered messages and documents in urban areas. They were actually a vital part of the city's communication network, delivering telegrams, packages, and other items. Many of them had worked for like telegraph companies, delivering telegrams from railroad depots to like recipients' homes and stuff like that, or people's places of business. So they often rode bikes just to make like faster deliveries and shit. So these guys were often paid a small amount per message. They earned like around $2 per week. That fucking ballin' back then. And they would travel at night, and this was like kind of shady, but they also traveled through seedy parts of towns, like even in the daytime, so whatever, right? Now, these dudes were essential for communication before the widespread adoption of telephones and other forms of electronic communication. So this boy described all the craziness to Albert here, like he would tell him his stories of like all the fucking bad times he had and shit. So this had turned Albert on, and then the two began a homosexual relationship for a time. And sometimes this carried over with like other boys joining in and shit. Now, because of this, Fish craved quite the sexual appetite, and this pretty much remained for the rest of his life. Now, his time in New York was like a sexual haven of nothing but male prostitutes for him. And Albert would just go sniff out the higher up clientele. He'd gain more funds for himself, right? And then he'd keep going. Now, he would work places like Broadway Gardens, there was Manila Hall, that was another spot, different spots like that. Besides being a man whore, he spent time at the YMCA on weekends. This was on the 8th Avenue on 57th Street, so he'd watch all the boys in the shower rooms, getting change and stuff. He'd peek through the windows, and he had this whole voyeurism hobby down pat, like he just indulged in this. Now, he'd also peek in, like, the St. Anne's Church. He would look through the windows to catch, like, choir boys in the change rooms and shit. This place was located up in the Bronx. He also got involved with an Italian boy who delivered ice to one of his apartments there. And this went on for a bit. And not long after all this fuckery here, Fish's mother, Ellen, had introduced him to a woman named Anna May Hoffman. She was a 19-year-old woman who stayed in the same boarding house, and the two wed at the Holy Communion Church. Now, Anna was born in 1879 up in Flushing, Queens County, New York, USA. Fish told her, like, some of his sexual interests here, and he wanted to make sure that she was at least into some of his weirdness. I'm sure she was just, like, in a regular banging and whatnot, but by 1903, the couple had some children. They didn't settle down much as Albert, like, was consistently on the go with, like, work and shit like that, but they moved wherever he went kind of deal. Kind of pissed off Anna a little bit, because the kids had things to do, and they could never finish their stuff at school, or their plays, or hang out with their friends and shit like that, right? They were always meeting new people. Now, Little Orphan Annie was a play that one of the kids were actually excited to finish, but because of the jobs and everything, there was one job up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The family actually left before the kid could finish up, and Anna was totally, like, pissed off. She actually called Fish selfish about the whole ordeal. So during the marriage, rumors went around about Albert and children, to the point of rape and seduction, to which he never dismissed. He'd just say, "I love children, and they are my greatest love." Little quotes like that. Even while married and having kids, Albert still went on seeing men, but he kept that on the down low. But as his kids were growing up, he wouldn't do like sexual things to his own family members or anything like that. He would just make up different kind of games, like he'd make games up, or like different kind of games for him and the kids to play. He'd make them guess stuff and try to get the right answer. And even if they did get the answer, like correct or anything, it was always wrong. And then he would make them punish him by hitting him with like a whip or something like that. They never thought anything weird of this. In their mind, like it was all a game. They never thought that he was going to get pleasure from this in any way. That's the only weird thing that he involved his kids in, minus them witnessing like some of the weird shit that he did to himself over the years. Some of the stuff he did was like eating raw meat and such, offering the kids like some meat, etc. Like, here, have some of this raw meat. They were like, no, we're good. So the family consisted of Albert, his wife, and the couple had 4 boys and 2 girls. Now, Albert's children were Albert Howard Fish Jr. He was born in 1899. He passed in 1963. There was Anna May Fish Collins. She was born in 1901, passed in 1995. Gertrude M. Fish DeMarco. She was born 1904, passed in 1989. Eugene Henry Fish, born 1907 and died in 1977. There was John William Fish, born 1910, passed 1989. And Henry Anthony Fish, born 1913, and he passed in 1991. Now, around this time here, he had a job as a manager of a cooperative store up in Patchogue, Long Island. So a cooperative store would be owned by like a controlled group of members who each have a share in it. Say like employees or customers, shit like that. It would be like a group of independently owned businesses that pool their resources to purchase in bulk and engage in like joint promotion efforts. This is where Fish was managing, and he was in control of all the stores, like the banking management and all that. And that was a big mistake. At one time during his job, there had been no money deposited for like over a week, and only about $800 in the store safe. The higher ups were pissed, and they asked Albert, like, what the fuck's going on, right? They just figured that it was him stealing money, and they told him to pay up. Albert was calm about it. He just said, the safe is empty, and he carried on. He was then given a 4-day deadline to get the money back, and he eventually just took the money out of the safe and fucked off. So he had like a 4-day head start now. But he ended up being arrested up in Long Island City. He was charged with larceny, and he was given 1 to 5 years in Sing Sing prison. And it was here that he dove deep in homosexuality. He got out 2 years later, but then he broke his parole off yet again. Then he got another 2 years up in Randall's Island Workhouse. So he ended up having a couple rough goes in prison that actually stuck with him. But he suppressed these memories by spending time with his family. He also made promises to his family that he wouldn't return to jail ever again. And he separated from them for like a little bit of long periods at a time because he had to go to work. So he devoted himself to be like this whole family man, and he started looking at the 10 Commandments pretty hard and tried to live just as the biblical life of Christ. So obviously he spewed this shit at his kids, stuff about a world of good and evil and all that. And if they only knew what their dad was up to, Now, whatever town he ended up working in, this would be probably like, when Sunday would hit up, he would end up dragging the kids and the wife along to whatever church was available. Now, he was working 2 jobs by this time, and he was barely able to support his wife and 6 kids. But he did whatever he could. He took jobs a little bit of a ways away from the family. It's not something that he wanted to do, something he had to do, right? But he still wanted to be close to his family. But, you gotta do what you gotta do. And he became a church caretaker for a time, and a handyman / janitor. He did this gig for short periods of time and was still able to see his family. Now, it was becoming quite expensive to move the family everywhere he went. But by the winter of 1917, he moved the entire family up to College Point up in Queens. Now, his eldest son, Albert Jr., was 18 years old by now, and he actually got a full-time job to help the family out. Then he got a notice for a job up in White Plains, so he was going to work there for a bit, and he gave his wife Anna a piece of paper with an address on it in case her or the kids needed anything from him, or like a place to get away or whatnot. They could come up there. So he traveled back and forth from work a few times a month. Now one day, upon his return home, he got news that his wife Anna had taken in a boarder. So this dude's name was John Peter Strobe. Now this dude was born February 13th, 1900 up in Jersey City, Hudson County, New Jersey. And since money was just tighter than tits, he needed that extra income. So Albert didn't really disagree with this. Now, on his time off, they would all hang out, play checkers, and other things to pass the time. So he would go back and forth to work here, spend time at home with his wife, the kids, and now John. Now, one day, while Fish was at work, he received a telegram while up in White Plains. It read, "Papa, Mom is gone. Please come home." So he had a suspicion that she had run off with this John fella. So he returned home to find the kids with absolutely nothing in that house. The children were left there all alone, and he found them all huddled together crying on the dining room floor. They were all bundled up in heavy clothing, the heat was cut off, and the house was completely bare. So everything that he had worked for, she had taken. Now his wife just ran off with this John dude, and they fucking took everything in the house. There were no beds for the kids. There was no furniture at all. They took the huge, like, 3-leaf maple table there, a set of 12 chairs, and they even took the stove from the kids. Now, this left Albert to take the kids over to his sister's, and this was located up in Flushing. Now, we listened to the children tell him how it all shook down. They said that Anna had given them, like, some coin to go to the movies, and this was like the 13th Street Picture Show. Now, when the movie was over, they returned home to find all their belongings gone. There was fuck all there for them, except like a single note that was found in the bathroom. This was laid on the bathtub. All it said was, "Get in touch with your father," and by the telegram, they did just that. Now, Albert was gone a few days longer than he thought he'd be, so he took all the kids back with him up to White Plains. Now, he was a little bit fearful about losing his job and shit like that, right? Because he needed this at that time. So while he was working up there, he had rented a room from some landlady chick at a rooming house. She let them all stay there and just upped his rent by like $25 a week. Plus there was this whole $10 breakage fee. But alas, that was too much money for him to fork out. He did stay there for like a little bit longer, and then he dipped out with the kids to have this whole fresh start. Now, with the money he saved by working all the extra hours that he could, him and the kids had gotten a hold of some used furniture, and they moved the family yet again. Now this time it was to an apartment building up in Elmsford, New York, and they stayed here for a bit. This wasn't until they leased a larger house that had like 9 rooms, a cellar, an attic, and a yard. Albert and his son got this place by pooling their money together, so they combined their incomes. But soon after, the whole deal didn't work out here, and nothing could progress with it, so they moved elsewhere. So when the deal didn't go through, young Albert Jr. was arrested for the same thing his dad was there, larceny. The police came up and hauled him off, and he was sentenced to Elmsford Reformatory. And Fish was yet again left alone to carry on the financial burden of the family, trying to make ends meet and all that, which was a hard thing to do in a house painter's salary. And then along with this came the feeling of dread, strain, and then along came some more shit for life to bring along. 4 months after Anna had deserted her family, she sent a letter to the house. She had made claims that her new boyfriend was starving her and just kicking the shit out of her. She begged his forgiveness and asked to come home to the family. So, having a change of heart during this hardship, Albert sent for her after reading this letter. He read the letter and got emotional. He was recalled saying, "That poor creature," and that was about his wife Anna. Now, upon her returning, she ran into Albert's arms like a fucking romance movie here. She gave the kids never-ending affection and had regretted her choices and made promises to change the relationship. There'd be no more arguing, no fighting, or silent nights. But by this time, Albert was keeping tabs on all the current expenses here. He wrote this all in this little ass brown book that he had, as to not be fooled by her. Now, by this time, Anna had been home for like a period of 2 weeks. Albert's calculations were on fucking point, but sometime later, the budget wasn't balancing itself. Now, there was 10 pounds of meat that was unaccounted for. So he asked Anna about it, and she just ended up turning shit around on him, right? Calling him a fucking miser and shit like that. And then she blamed the family dog for getting into some of the meat, etc., right? And she's probably right, dogs do get into shit. So he thought, it's possible. So he kept a closer watch on his lovable pooch. Now one night, the dog went up the stairs and Albert decided to follow him and see what he was doing. Here he was whining and pawing at their attic door, which was kind of unusual. So curiosity got the best of Albert, and he pushed the door open. He followed the dog inside the open door. It was really dark in there, and he had stumbled over something on the floor when he went in. Here, he heard a voice say, "What do you got for me this time?" And here was a nice little surprise. And here it was John fucking Strobe living in his attic. And old John Boy was covered up in all the good blankets that she had recently stole from Albert and her kids 4 months ago. So obviously this made Albert fucking pissed off. Here she was begging to come back to Albert, but still having a new boyfriend hidden away up in the attic. So here she was still madly in love with John. Fucking feeding him when the house was empty, having sex with him when nobody was around, and just feeding him all the groceries that fucking Albert was paying for. So he threw them both out into the street and told them never to come back. So several years later, when Fish's kids had the measles here and were feeling a little bit under the weather, Anna was still close to one of the daughters. She said that she would be willing to come home and care for them, and would ask Albert if she could be a housekeeper or something like that, right? Now, her boyfriend John was still a fucking bum. He was always out of work. And the couple had 2 children, and they couldn't even afford to look after them properly. Which, sucks. Because, kids need proper necessities and a good home life. Now, the 2 babies needed better care because Straub was just a fucking incompetent fuck. This was an offer that I'm sure Albert would not refuse. And unfortunately, he refused it. But sometime later, he heard that Anna had biffed it hard one day and broke her leg. Albert heard about this whole thing and he kind of poked fun at her by calling her Old Pegleg. The 2 never divorced, and that's that. No more bullshit relationship with a crusty old manipulating cunt. And the whole situation had fucked with his head a lot. Her leaving, telling him that she still loved him, and finding out that she was still banging the man that she left him for and was hiding him in the attic. Who fucking does that, right? But, some women are fucking wild, but... Now, Anna died in 1938 of heart issues. She's buried up in St. Michael's Cemetery, East Elmhurst, Queens County, New York. And Straub had died up in 1978, as is up in Morris County, New Jersey, USA. And with Albert now playing both roles of the parent, it totally drained him, and it started to show. He actually started to look a lot older in the coming years. He was now 48 years old, looking more pale. His hair was thinning. All of life's fuckery had hit him very hard. Even his cheeks were starting to sink in, and he had those blackened bags forming under his eyes. And when he walked about the town, it's like he did so to some sad-ass song playing in his head. He shuffled slowly down the street everywhere he traveled. And it didn't help that he was wearing suits that were several sizes too large for him. Everything about his life was just messing with his head. His father's passing, the orphanage, the beatings, and, some jail time during his life. So he began thinking that Anna was his Judas. And this here is when the voices would start. He would start hearing random voices on the daily. Mostly these started happening at nighttime. Mostly godlike shit, religion and all that stuff that he crammed into his brain over the last 48 years of his life. At first, the voices started in his bedroom, as if they were coming from like the corner of the kids' rooms and stuff, but he thought it was the kids fucking with him, but maybe playing some sort of prank or something like that. So he would get up and check on the kids, and he found them fast asleep. So obviously it wasn't them doing it. The voices weren't them. So where were they coming from? He talked to his daughters about it, and he even thought the place was haunted. And they even talked to the landlady about it. And Albert had began drawing black crosses on the doors just to keep evil spirits away. So by drawing a black cross on your door, it's a standard practice for warding off evil spirits, but it can be a symbol of faith or protection in some cultures, particularly Christianity. So historically, these marks, including crosses and other symbols, were used to protect homes from witchcraft, evil spirits, so they would often be put near entrances like doors or windows. So these marks, often scratched on the walls or doorways, were intended to prevent negative forces from entering. Now in 1919, he would start taking the family on ghost hunts, looking for spirits, just like the Ghostbusters. Don't cross the streams, all that shit. Now one time, he was reading the newspaper with his daughter when he jumped up to his feet and said, "What was that?" To which she was like, "What the fuck?" And she did the same thing. Albert made mention that he was just spoken to. Both had raised their eyes to the ceiling, and there was nothing there, but they kept staring up there, right? Maybe there was something that went through there. And another time, his daughter awoke to find him wrapped up in a carpet in the middle of their living room, completely naked, only with his head showing from one end, and she asked him what he was doing, and he replied with, "I'm following the instructions of John the Apostle." And by now, his sexual desire for children had started to run fucking rampant. So it just seemed that things got a lot weirder after his wife had left. Even while with Anna, he did see boys, but he kept it on the down low. He called what he was doing fancies and nothing more. When it was just him and the kids, he started to lose his mind. He was starting to have hallucinations about the Bible and John the Apostle. And here, he would start to inflict pain on himself. Now, I think I'm going to hop off on this episode here, and I'll continue on here tomorrow. And we'll talk more about this pain that he inflicted on himself. So I'd like to thank you for tuning in to Twisted Tales, folks, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Twisted Tales.